All right, it's 9 o'clock in the morning on the west coast of the United States. Again, thank you for all of you joining today for 2020 presidential address of WRSA. And I'm Jaiwan Lim. I'm the executive director of Western Regional Science Association. And of course, we had planned this event in the middle of our conference in the beautiful Waikiki Beach. And unfortunately, we had to cancel the whole meeting. And thanks for understanding. And of course, that was the best decision we could make considering the situation with the COVID-19. Once again, and thanks for your patience, thanks for your understanding. But we'll do our best to deliver the presidential address today by our new president, Janet Kohlhase from University of Houston. And we have our chair, Giuliano, our immediate past president of WRSA. And I have a couple of other announcements before we start the event. And you can actually share the link at the end of the event. I'm going to share the link on our WRSA website and also send out the mass email. So you can share the link with colleagues who could not join the live event today. They can always watch it afterwards. And also it is live streamed on the Facebook page of the WRSA. And if you have any questions or the comments on Janet's presentation, please use our function, chat function, and you can post your question with your name and the affiliation. That'd be really helpful. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our immediate past president, Giuliano. Before I toss it over to her, I really want to express my special thanks to Giuliano, because as a former president facing this unexpected COVID-19, she made the right decision, she showed the leadership and then made a good decision for our group. And then we had to get through all those hard times, but she did a wonderful job for us. Thank you again. And then I'm going to introduce Giuliano.
Thanks, Jaiwan, and actually the thanks on managing Hawaii actually goes to Jaiwan, who spent untold hours negotiating with hotels, et cetera, to cancel the meeting in a way that gave us as little damage as possible. But now we get to move on, and I'm really pleased that we are having this meeting today, that we're having the presidential address. And I wanted to just start with kind of a little personal thought, and that is, for those of us who have been presidents, doing the presidential address is really the big deal of the honor of becoming president. And I'm guessing Janet, just as I did and several before me, thought about, oh my, now what am I going to do for the presidential address? And that leads to huge amounts of work and effort to create a paper that you hope will be good enough given the many great people who stood before you. When the conference was canceled in March, all I could think of was, oh dear, Janet has spent all this time preparing, and here she is with a great paper that none of us are going to hear. So for me, I'm really pleased that we are able to do this and to honor Janet as the incoming president. This is great. I don't have to say too much, I don't think, about Janet, because we all know her so well. She's been a stalwart member of WRSA and NARSC for many years. She was named a Regional Science Association International Fellow in 2018, and that's as good as it gets in the world of regional science. She got her PhD. She's definitely the pedigree in what I would call the pedigree in regional science, because her degree is from University of Pennsylvania, which is, one of the great places for regional science over the years. She's been a co-editor of the Annals of Regional Science. She has been very busy with the editorial boards on the major regional science journals. So she has definitely done her share for the profession. And so with no further ado, I would like to introduce Janet. The name of her talk is Labor Force Diversity and New Firm Formulation. So Janet, are you on?
I am on. Can you see me?
Very good. And I will go off. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Jen, thanks so much for your very kind introduction. It took me a while to decide, okay, I should just do this via Zoom, my presidential address. And I think, you know, it's probably a smart thing to do that because so many meetings are going online now. So I thought, let's just go for it. And so I'm thanking everybody for being here. And I also want to put a shout out to Jen for, you know, being a wonderful president. You know, we work together and we'll probably continue to work together over the next year or so. Definitely interesting time. Okay, without further ado, let me pull up my slides and we'll start talking. Okay, so let me just talk about my paper. A paper is part of a larger project I've been working on for several years with Michaela Bachman of GIBS in Sweden. And this particular paper is called Labor Force Diversity and New Firm Formation. In my talk, I'll mostly talk about this paper, but I'll integrate a little bit of another paper that we have that's forthcoming in JRS that uses the same basic data, but in a different way. And let's go on to the next slide. So let's just put ourselves in the context of what this paper is about. It's about looking at the world before COVID, and we're looking at firms in an environment where there's all sorts of changes going on. So there's increasing competition, there's rapid transformation of markets at the local, national, and global levels, and many countries are feeling a big inflow of immigrants. And that probably stopped pretty much during the COVID times. That's why I wrote up there until February. Other things that have been going on in labor markets, there's been increase in female labor force participation across different sectors. It's not just that you're a nurse or a teacher anymore, you can be a CEO. So in summary, there's basically diversity in all sorts of dimensions of the labor force. So this particular paper is asking the question is, how does this labor force relate to aspects of the firm environment? And this paper, we're looking at new firm formation. So it's an interesting aspect about firm productivity and important to regional development. So we want to ask, how is new firm formation related to the challenging and changing environment that we see out there? So we're going to look at mostly the diversity of the labor force at a lower level of aggregation that we call the municipal level. And you'll see in a little bit more detail how I define it. And the work that we're talking about today is distinct from, like I said, this paper I mentioned earlier, the paper that Michaela and I wrote, and it's coming out in JRS, forthcoming sometime in the future. And that one, we look at individual firm survival. This one, we're looking at new firm formation. So if you want to think for a little bit about new firm formation, it pretty much is related to regional development. And there's a huge literature out there, and I'll just talk a little bit about some of it, that new firm formation is associated with future local economic growth that's greater than if we didn't have this new firm formation. So several papers have found that. If we look at back in Glazer in 2009, he's looking at several aspects of local startups in the US, and he finds that labor supply is the driving force, which makes us think, okay, let's look more about the labor supply aspect. There's another paper that you'll hear about, I'm sure, in my discussion by Martin himself and Levison and Partridge. It's a working paper now that also looks at local startups and looks at municipal aspects of it. But we look at a bit more detail about the role of the diversity of the labor force. So we consider our paper complementary to Martin's. So let's just talk a little bit about, you know, loose quote theory about the benefits and costs of labor force diversity for new firm formation. So we're going to talk about diversity till you're probably sick of it as I go through this talk. But we're going to talk about diversity in terms of the individual backgrounds of the potential labor force. So we're going to look at cultural diversity, which basically looks at the region of origin. So like what country would the worker come from? A lot of them are immigrants. And I'll show you some slides in the, just down the road here showing you how much we have of immigrants in Sweden, which is the country we're going to study. We're going to look at diversity in terms of the typical things people think about the demographics of the labor force, the gender, the age. We're going to look at educational achievement and modify it by looking at the diversity aspects of it. And then we'll also look at aspects of occupation, industrial structure in the local area where the firm is going to locate. So let's think about what are some of the benefits of diversity, and we'll think about what are some of the costs too. Diversity of a labor force might signal a milieu of creativity, innovation, and openness. So this is sort of attributed to Jacobs, 1961. So, you know, we have creative cities, maybe it's an incubator for new firms. There's also the diverse labor force may positively affect the rate of information exchange. And if we have more information exchange, that might act as a lubricant to facilitate startups and maybe innovation. Continuing on with Jacobs, the ideas that are in this exchange flow to these recipients who hopefully will start new firms. And then if we think about just other diversity aspects about the individual background of the labor force, if there's a diverse labor force, there might be increased demand for more unique services and products. So that might stimulate regional development. Immigrants, several people have found that immigrants might be more likely to start a firm or become self-employed. And there's a whole literature on that. So everything isn't all benefits. So there probably are some costs. And here's a couple of ideas about potential costs about a diverse environment for new firm formation. It might be that homogeneity of the labor force might have certain advantages, and those advantages might reduce firm costs for running the firm as well as some of the startup costs. And some of that's been introduced by Costa and Kahn in 2003. And the idea behind it is that groups with a common background or common language or same cultural norms might have an easier time in cooperating and interacting. And other people have studied things where locations that have very heterogeneous residents might cause costs on the firms because there might be a decreased level of civil engagement in government interaction. And that's been explored by Costa and Kahn and Vigdor. So, summing up my background theoretical framework here, we expect both positive and negative relations between our different measures of diversity and new firm formation. So ultimately, it's going to be an empirical question to see which effect dominates. So now on to some details of our study. You probably already guessed the location is Sweden, and we're looking at municipalities, which is really the smallest governmental administrative unit in Sweden. And we're going to have in our data set 280 out of the possible 290 that exist today. So here's some maps. And if you look on your left, you see the map of Sweden with 290 municipalities. And in the southern part of the country is where the big cities are, Gothenburg, Malmö, and Stockholm. And if you look over on the right side of the screen, the 76 local labor markets basically aggregate some of those municipalities to local labor markets defined by commuting zones. And we have chosen to focus on the municipalities, but we do account for some of the local labor market characteristics in defining some of our variables, and you'll see that below. And here's just showing you in a little bit more detail some of the big cities and the local labor markets and the composition of the municipalities. Okay, so we are doing an aggregate study, but we make our aggregate study out of individual firm and individual worker data from Statistics Sweden. You know, Americans are always so jealous of the Europeans that you can actually get this firm level data and individual data, and you can trace them. It's an amazing data set. So it has annual data on all individuals and all active firms in Sweden. And you can get access to it, but it's of course restricted access. For this paper, we take this individual data and we aggregate it to the municipal level. And out of that, we construct our own balanced panel of municipalities from the year 1993 to 2010. And so we end up having 17 years as we have one lagged variable of data for the 280 municipalities. So I'm going to spend a bit of time just talking about the data and how we had to create a bunch of variables. And so I'm just giving you a little heads up. Okay, we're going to talk about variable creation here. First talk about the dependent variable, and then talk about our myriad of diversity measures of the labor market, and then briefly talk about some of our other control variables that we're going to count for other demand supply factors for new firm formation. Okay, so the first variable is the all important dependent variable. And so we want to basically count the number of new firms. And so I call them the startups. But because the municipalities have different sizes and labor force, it's smart to standardize by the size of the labor force. And this was first suggested by Aldrich and Fritsch in 1994. So we're following their suggestion. And we're defining the labor force for those working age 18 to 65. Okay, then in order to analyze diversity, you know, we had a lot of discussion about what kind of variable, what kind of measures should we use. And we concluded that maybe the entropy measures would be the way to go with. There's other things you could use, but we decided to use the entropy measures, and they're also called tile indices. And there's a nice summary of the different types of measures of diversity in a chapter by Nijkamp and Poot in 2015. It has advantages over the often used Herfindahl index. You can decompose the indices, and there's a useful weighting structure. And when a class size changes, we have a more desirable outcome on our index than under some of these other indices. So we're going to end up constructing entropy measures of all sorts of things in our data. We're going to measure culture, which basically is the background countries that people come from and the demographics. And then we're going to also use a concept called related and unrelated variety and look at occupation, industrial structure with that, and also move it over to education. And this is this concept of related and unrelated variety is relatively new. And I made a couple of sites there, Franken et al. 2007 and Wixie and Andersson 2016 also use this concept. Okay, so let's just spend a little bit of time talking about Sweden as a culturally diverse country, where a lot of people might not expect that. It certainly is an immigrant destination. And if you look at a diagram, which I'll show you in a second, the share of immigrants is soaring over time. So if you look at this, as a percent of the population in 1990, immigrants were about 8%, but by 2011, it soared, doubled over like 16%. So that's akin to the US, if not even more intense there. And this table is probably hits you in the eyes, but it tries to give you a little bit of feeling for where these immigrants are coming from. Now, our data set doesn't give us the exact country in many cases. It just gives us a region. So if you look at on the left there, region, we have Middle East, EU, new members, Africa, Asia, the Balkans, Nordic countries, North America, and the EU 15 and other. And then I have the total by year and the proportion over the time period I'm showing here, which is 1990 to 2010. And so if you take a look at that right-hand column proportion 1990 to 2010, you see that about 21% of the immigrants during that time period were from the Middle East, okay? And if you take a look at the second column, 1995 to 1999, look at the bottom there, the proportion of Middle Easterners in 95 to 99 was 15%. So that was a big group. So that's what often gets discussed about. Nordic is probably the biggest proportion, about 12%, and other, of course, is the biggest, 27%. So just to give you an idea, there is a lot of diversity going on there. Okay, so what do we do with all this? So we start off measuring cultural diversity in the context of this tile index using an entropy measure. The tile indices is really a sums of logs, weighted logs of proportions. And so that's why that negative sign is there, to get the fraction to be a positive, okay? So anyway, what we do is we sum up over the categories we're looking at. So for cultural diversity, we have 10 categories, and so C is a category. And the categories are the regions of origin that I had listed basically in that a previous table. We have Sweden in there, unlike the previous table, Nordic countries except Sweden, the EU 15, except Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, Europe except the EU 15 and Nordic countries, Russia, North America, South America, Asia, Africa, and Oceania. So the cultural diversity captures all this. And I represents the inhabitants in a municipality, and C represents the number of people in that category. So we're weighting, we're looking at the proportion of people in each category, okay? And we just take the weighted sum of the logs of that ratio. And so if you take a look at the index and you wonder what the size it means, the lowest level can be 0, and that's if there's no diversity. And the highest level of diversity is going to be the log of C. So basically, a larger number indicates more diversity. That's how you should interpret that. So an alternative measure of cultural diversity is to just take simply, instead of calculating all these things, just the share of inhabitants of Sweden that were born outside Sweden. And so we just call that variable the share of immigrants. Okay, moving on to our next entropy measure is looking at demographics, and we have there's a variety of ages, and there's hopefully 2 genders. There could be more, but we counted for 2 in this. And so the demographic diversity is also an entropy measure, and I don't have to really describe it so much since I described it in the previous one. And so we're just, what differs here is that the categories are now age and gender categories, and there's now 12 categories instead of 10, as in the previous slide. Okay, moving on. We have also entropy measures of education, occupation, and industry diversity, but it's a little bit more complicated measure. What we're going to do is sum what are called unrelated variety and related variety, which are themselves entropy measures. And we're just doing a sum, and we feel this is okay to do, and we decomposed it and found our results pretty much hold up. We just, because those the subcomponents are decomposable, I think it's okay to sum it. So educational, occupational, and industry diversity just sum up the 2 parts that we call unrelated variety and related variety. And let's just give you a little bit of intuition, and I'll show you a formula. For unrelated variety, again, it's an entropy measure. You're going to see this weighted sum of the log proportions. And the unrelated variety looks at a higher level of aggregation. So you want to consider that a measure of diversity across broad groups. Okay, so maybe SIC codes in like the US, 2-digit codes. And then if you go within each of those high level, there's a component there too. So the related variety is a weighted sum of entropy at this finer level of aggregation that is within each level. So it's diversity within that broad group. So there's sort of 2 sets of diversity going on at the same time here. And so here's the painful equation. I won't torture you with it too much, but if you look at unrelated variety, it looks exactly like our diversity measures we had for demographic and cultural, except now I'm saying P is a proportion. I'm not writing out, a fraction there, but here P sub G is the share of total employment at the higher level in this municipality M, okay? And then related variety just takes that higher level and then weights it by this HG, which sums through all the smaller categories within it. Mm-hmm. So just to show you here, there's potential a lot of categories in these. So the high level is the unrelated variety, and the finer level is related variety. So education, we have 27 high levels and finer levels, a total of 354. And occupational, 11 high level, and industry 60. So potentially there's a lot of different things to be summing over. Okay, so enough of our variables of main interest, the entropy variables, the diversity variables. We also have some control variables. So if you want to say, what's the impact of diversity on new firm formation, you got to control for other forces that are important there. So we divided them into what we considered supply variables and demand variables. So the supply variables from the supply side of the firm, firms per capita is a good indicator variable for the extent of local competition within the municipality. And then we take a look at average number of employees for each firm in the municipality, and we just call that mean firm size. And again, that's another measure trying to capture the local competition environment. And then we also have the local municipal unemployment rate to account for any labor market slack that's going on in that given year. Okay, then we go look at the demand side. So that's, the demand of the consumers in the municipality. So we have what we call change in demand, which just looks at the change in earnings in a municipality from the previous year to the current year. And that's basically going to give us a measure of localized growth and decline. And then we, of course, realize that, trade occurs and, markets go beyond just the local municipality. So we want to look at what's called a market potential, which is a way for aggregating potential purchases in areas surrounding the municipality of interest. So there's basically a hierarchy that we're looking at there, and we deflate all these earnings by distance. And just to give you a little bit of an idea, I won't give the torturous equation, but market potential for a given municipality can be decomposed into 3 size components. And size components are just basically adding up the municipal wages in the given set of municipalities that we're going to look at. And then these are going to be discounted by travel time and a distance decay. And the distance decay lambdas we are taking from the article cited at the bottom there, Johansson, Clausen, and Olsen, 2003. So you have different distance decay for the different hierarchies in the market we're looking at. So M, the local municipality itself, and then psi sub R is the region outside of that municipality, and that's going to be defined as the local labor market. That's where that map I showed you earlier comes in. And then H, I call it the hinterland. That's area outside the region, the local labor market, outside the municipality. And so, farther away has less demand. It's basically a gravity model concept here. So that's one of our control variables. Okay, so now let me just give you a little feeling for our data. So we have, over our time period, 280 municipalities that we could trace the data through. That gives us a total sample of about 5,047.60. And just to give you an idea of a new firm formation, if you take a look at all the municipalities, on average, there's about 12 firms, new firms each year in each municipality. If you, I'm sorry, 12 firms per 1,000 working people in each municipality. Sorry, I didn't deflate that correctly. And then if you look at our diversity variables, so demographic diversity, the mean is 2.3. Cultural diversity, the mean is 0.45. And education, occupational, and industry diversity is all over 3, almost 4. So they definitely have different number of categories, so they can each have a different, maximum size of the value. But basically, a higher number there indicates more diversity within the category we're talking about. And finally, if you look at the very bottom of the graph or table, the share of immigrants is about 14% over the whole time period we're talking about. And then just to give you a little bit of feeling for the control variables, the change in demand, so the annual change in the sum of the inhabitants' wages is about 140 million SECs. And then the market potential, all the surrounding deflated wages on average is about 13,911 million. So we're talking millions there. Unemployment rate is about 4% over the time period. And our mean establishment size is about 7 employees per firm. And the number of existing firms per 1,000 population is about 60. So we have about 12 new firms each year, and we have about 60 existing for each 1,000 population across our sample. Okay, so just let me report now some of my empirical results. So the design is, again, even though we have this data that's individual level, we've aggregated up to municipality level. So the municipalities is the unit of observation in our data. We have 280 of them. And so we're going to estimate as our main result panel data fixed effects model using data from 93 through 2010. And our question of interest is, how does diversity relate to the rate of new firm formation? And we're going to look at these dimensions: demographic, cultural, educational, industry, occupational, and share of immigrants. So I'm basically just going to report results on our variables of interest and not report the results on the control variables, but they're in the paper. Okay, so here's just the empirical specification. We take our new firm formation that's normalized by the labor force and take the log of it. And then it's just a function of the diversity vector. And the diversity vector has the components demographic, cultural, educational, industry, occupational, and share immigrants. And then the X vector is a vector of the control variables I just briefly talked about. We're trying to capture some of the demand supply concept components. So the change in demand in the local municipality itself, the market potential for the rest of the area, unemployment rate, the mean firm size, and firms per capita. And then we have municipality M fixed effects at alpha sub M, and gamma sub T is time fixed effects. So here's the main result, table 2. And again, I'm just taking off from the table the results on our variables of interest, and I'm not reporting the goodness of fit, but they were actually pretty good, and sample sizes, so on and so forth. But what I've done, there's 2 columns, column 1 and 2, and column 1 is measuring the cultural diversity using our entropy measure, and column 2 uses, instead of that entropy measure, just the share of immigrants. And so if you take a look at the coefficients, you know, the sign and the significance tells us that there is a positive relation between demographic diversity and new firm formation, between cultural diversity and new firm formation, and educational diversity and new firm formation. In column 1 and column 2, the same thing holds, except now we're using share of immigrants. It's also positively related. So we're seeing results here that our diversity measures are effective in being related to new firm formation. Comment there on industry diversity, it comes out basically insignificant. And there's always some argument, should you actually have industry controls in some of these models? It's not surprising that they come out insignificant because there's other forces working, and on the margin, it just maybe doesn't matter what the industry diversity is right there. And then occupational diversity, because we didn't have the data on occupation for the whole time period of our study, it only goes from 2002 through 2010. So we ran the same model, and I'm just reporting the occupational diversity results. Again, column 1 has cultural diversity as entropy measure, and column 2 has the share immigrants. And again, occupational diversity doesn't show up as being statistically significantly related to new firm formation. And kind of the same argument goes here as probably for the industrial diversity, that other things have already equilibrated, and on the margin, I wouldn't expect that to matter much. So that's what we found there. And just to give you a little bit of, I guess, comfort in interpreting these coefficients, I'm going to just let you know what happens if we do a 1 standard deviation increase in the diversity measure, and what happens to the prediction of our dependent variable. So if we look at demographic diversity, and just to remind you, it's our measure for age and gender diversity, that has the largest effect, and you can see that on the previous table. If you take the 1 standard deviation change, that implies about a 5.6% increase in new firm formation. So that's, you know, not insignificant. It's not, you know, 0.0002, right? And cultural diversity, again, remind you, it's the region of origin of the inhabitants. One standard deviation increase in cultural diversity also has a positive impact on new firm formation, or a positive relation with it. And if we go and use the share of immigrants instead of the cultural diversity, we get about the same size, 3.9% increase. So they're consistent. Educational diversity, if we increase that by one standard deviation, that's associated with a 2.7 increase in new firm formation. And then we can always interpret the magnitudes as an elasticity instead of as the one standard deviation change. You just, you're having a semi-log functional form, and you can just calculate the elasticities. And again, the demographic diversity has the largest effect. Elasticity is 3.5. Many other elasticities are much more muted. So cultural diversity, 0.11, so very inelastic. Share immigrants about the same at 0.07. Educational diversity, a bit more of an impact, 0.32 elasticity. But the demographic seems to be the strongest relation with new firm formation among our population measures here. Okay, alternative specifications. We really want to do causal discussion, but we aren't really convinced we can. We tried to account for potential endogeneity, at least for cultural diversity, or the share immigrants, by trying an instrumental variable approach. And the second thing we did was try to split our sample to see if that made a difference. So let's first talk about our IV for cultural diversity. So we used the share of immigrants in 1990 as an instrument for cultural diversity, or share of immigrants. Okay, so that's outside of our time period. And so that's motivated by Swedish policy changes. So basically pre-1991, in Sweden, the government allocated immigrants to different municipalities. But post-91, the immigrants were allowed much more free choice of location. So we figured that that would be a good way to get rid of some of the endogeneity. And so because of the structure of our data, we couldn't use a fixed effect with the IV, because basically the fixed effect would be collinear with this 1990 share of immigrants. So the best thing we could do is use a random effects instrumental variable estimator. And if you look at this table right here, table 4, columns 1 and 2 show the same results in terms of signs and significance on the variables. So we still get a positive relation for demographic diversity and cultural diversity and educational diversity with new firm formation, also a share of immigrants. So we feel that that is supportive of our result. And then finally, we split the sample, and we went back to our original approach where we did the fixed effects estimates. And we split the sample into high share of immigrants in 1990 and low share of immigrants in 1990, and then we subdivided urban, rural. And the results there basically show that the splitting of the sample does matter. Demographic diversity is more important for the sample where we have a low share of immigrants in 1990 than the high share, but they're both significant. Cultural diversity doesn't show up in the sample where we have a low share of immigrants in 1990, but it does in the high share. And industry diversity, again, is insignificant. And then if you look at the bottom, I'll show you the different sample sizes. And again, urban, rural, we get some differences. Demographic diversity is only significant related in rural. And this is, it's a marginal impact. I guess it makes sense. It's more important there in the rural areas, and cultural diversity too, and education. So we don't really find stuff in the urban. This is on the margin. They're already, pretty sophisticated. Okay, so I'm about ready to conclude. I think I might have gone longer than I thought. Our data set is great. It has detailed data from Sweden on individual firms and the workers, and we made use of that great data set. And we decided to use entropy measures, which better capture the distribution of diversity than some of the other measures of diversity that have been used out there. And we feel like our result complements Martin and his other co-authors' paper, which he'll probably talk about in a minute, by adding more detail on this labor force diversity as a potential source of impact on new firm formation. And then we also have some, I think, strong controls. So using these strong controls, we pretty have a high certainty of our diversity impacts. So we compare cultural diversity and demographic. Those are the two big ones that I'm going to be talking about. And we're able to examine, we think, understudied potential sources of agglomeration. We find, just to review again, that demographic diversity is associated with increases in new form formation, and cultural diversity is also associated with new form formation, but maybe not as strong as a demographic. And so, you know, just interpreting the results, we want to say, are there, is this consistent with agglomeration benefits to diverse populations? So I'm going to, you know, take a step here to interpret this and hopefully convince you. So we're going to look at the relative benefits of cultural and demographic diversity to think about these agglomeration benefits. So this is where I'm going to pull back some of the other work that we've been working on, the paper with Michaela, where we look at individual firm survival. And in that paper, we have vectors of controls. Some are characteristics of the firm itself, and some are characteristics of the municipality. And so in that paper about firm survival, we find that firm survival decreases when we have increases in municipal demographic diversity. That's a different relation than what we find here. Here we find that there's an increase in new firm formation when we have an increase in demographic diversity. So if we integrate the two results of the two papers, so you know, firm survival sort of measures the length of the firm, and the new firm formation is the beginning of the firm. It seems like there must be churning of firms in these metropolitan areas. And then if we move into the cultural diversity variable to look at, again, the JRS looks at firm specific and the municipal, and I'm talking about the municipal results there. In the firm survival paper, we find for the municipality that survival increases with cultural diversity at the municipal level, and we also find that here. So if we integrate the two results, it suggests that there's an increase probably in product diversity associated with these new firms and firms surviving. And I can pull that out and say that's probably a measure of some of the Jacobs ideas about the agglomeration benefits of a diverse population. So that is the last thing I want to say, and I'll end with my U of H slide. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing and turn it over to Martin.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And I think we need some virtual applause for the talk. So we should all be clapping. Thank you very much. A very interesting presentation, as we knew it would be. Next up is Martin Andersson as the discussant. Are you ready, Martin?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much.
Okay. Turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me see. I can just okay, or do you see my screen now?
Yes.
Perfect. I will just go, and you still see it, right? You see the whole screen now. Perfect. Okay, many thanks, especially to you, Janet. A very nice presentation. I have been asked to discuss this presidential address by Janet. I very much appreciate this question. I really like the paper. These are, you know, the new firm formation and the determinants of new firm formation in different regions, especially in Sweden, is something I have myself worked with. And I have to say that I think this paper is, as was shown by the presentation, is a very inspiring and fresh look on several of the issues that is discussed in this literature. So what I will do, I will basically just summarize my reading of the paper and Janet's presentation, and then go on with some comments and questions and maybe ideas built that is based on Janet's presentation. So as an overview, I think it's a very nice presentation and a very nice paper. I read this paper with pleasure. I got it actually earlier from Janet. Well, I think it was in March or February, something like that. And I really much like this paper. as was clear from the presentation, a main novelty in the paper is that it looks at various dimensions of diversity at the same time. So in the literature on let's say the determinants of new firm formation in different cities and different regions, so diversity has always been there as an important, let's say, explanatory factor or explanatory variable. But it's typically measured in the typical way to do it is to look at, let's say, diversity in terms of industry. And I think that this idea of bringing in different dimensions of diversity, like culture, education, demography, occupation, is really an interesting take on this issue. I also agree with Janet that using entropy measures brings several advantages, not only the decomposition or the possibility for decomposition, but it also has a number of, I think, characteristics that are advantages, especially compared to the typical Herfindahl index. So what the paper does is then to create these different types of different variables of that captures different dimensions of diversity, and it looks at the influence on the rate of new firm formation in Sweden, and it builds on these 280 municipalities that we have in Sweden. We actually have a somewhat large number of municipalities, but as is well explained in the paper, because of the borders or the delineations change over time, the typical strategy is to use the 280 municipalities that is looked at in this paper. I also think that the long-term panel data is very good, and there is much to like in this paper. So I will just start by just a brief overview of my perspective on why this issue is important. So first of all, I think there's a great need for papers that look into the determinants of new firm formation, and I think there are three main reasons for that. First, as Janet said, there are many papers, recent papers that take great care in trying to isolate the causal influence of new firm formation on the long-run regional development. So, for example, the famous Ed Glaser paper on distance to coal mines, Michael Fritsch version of that paper for Germany, for instance, are examples of papers that really take great care in trying to really see, is it really new firm formation or entrepreneurship that matters for long-run regional development? And all these papers that use quite sophisticated techniques do show that new firm formation has an independent and a causal influence on the long-run development of regions. So that in itself is a very strong motivation for why we need to better understand the drivers of new firm formation. A second argument, which I think is important to bear in mind, is that recent literature also point to that it's not only, let's say, the Schumpeterian type of entrepreneurs that matters. So Schumpeter, in his Mark I hypothesis, sort of hypothesized that it's really the small new entrants. They come into markets by introducing some kind of innovation. It can be organizational, it can be a new product, a new service, but it sort of disrupt markets and stuff like that, right? And that has meant that a lot of the papers that focus explicitly on entrepreneurship tend to lean towards trying to focus on, let's say, the small part of new firms that are closer to the Schumpeterian tradition. So that typically means that you focus on high-tech entrepreneurs, you focus on very innovative entrepreneurs, and so on. From the viewpoint of regional development, I think that's fine, but it tends to exclude a lot of important things. So, for example, Israel Kirzner, who had a different conception of entrepreneurship, where he also said that, well, it's true that some entrepreneurs, they might disrupt markets, but so many entrepreneurs, and perhaps also the bulk of entrepreneurs, what they do is they respond to demand, right? So I mean, if you have a population growth in a region, it might give room for more cafes, more restaurants, and these types of low-end services businesses. And there's a strong recognition in literature now that type of entrepreneurship actually matters very much for the growth of cities and the growth of regions, because it's, you know, that is the type of entrepreneurship that make regions, to use a popular term, livable, right? It creates an interesting consumption environment, and it creates amenities and so on. So that, I think, is important in this context, because as Janet and Michaela does in this paper, they not only look at a particular type of entrepreneurship, they look at the, let's say, the total stock of new firms in a given year. And a third argument for looking at the determinants of new firm formation is that there is also a lot of evidence supporting the idea that social interactions are very important in stimulating entrepreneurs. So basically what that means is that entrepreneurs tend to learn or get inspired from other entrepreneurs. So learning entrepreneurship from other entrepreneurs. And that means that from a policy perspective, you can have a lot of long-run benefits by, you know, being able to push entrepreneurship, because once you get that going, it can sort of feed itself over time. And as Janet said in her presentation, you know, there are many arguments for why diversity is important. I mean, in the case of Sweden, which is also very well explained in the paper, we have had rising industry diversity for quite a long time. I mean, since the main economic recession or crash we had in the beginning of the 1990s, there has been a strong productivity growth in manufacturing, although employment has been stagnant, but we have had an explosion in private services industries. So that has meant that whatever measure you have on the industrial diversity will show that for the Swedish economy at large, we do have a rising industrial diversity. We also have had a very strong immigration. We have also had rising education levels. We had, in the 1990s, we had a huge decentralization of the university system, which meant that a lot of people nowadays, you know, they take on some kind of university education in different fields and so on. And that also means that we have a rising diversity in education. At the same time, Sweden is a country which have a very strong geographic fragmentation of jobs and growth, where we have the main hubs, Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö. There are cities that grow fast, and the human capital tend to concentrate in these large cities or large city regions, which means that issues of where things happen and issues of how you can promote entrepreneurship, not only in the urban regions, but also in other regions, are issues of very strong importance. So I think that this paper fills a very nice gap in the literature, and it also relates very closely to issues of great concern, not least in the Swedish economy. Okay, just a small recap. So my reading of the paper and Diana's presentation is that the main finding is that there's a positive effect of a diverse set of inhabitants in terms of region of origin, age, gender, and education on new firm formation. And I also think this result seems to be very robust. I particularly like the robustness tests. They are very nice. And I think the idea of exploiting this 1991 reform in refugee placement is a very nice strategy. And they sort of, those robustness tests really confirm the main findings, I would say. I also agree, and I think the sample splits that are done by looking at municipalities with high immigrant share and low immigrant share, and to run the models for urban and rural municipalities separately, are very nice. And I particularly also liked this quote from Jane Jacobs, namely that you say in the conclusions that your paper adds some empirical rigor to the classic claim or idea by Jane Jacobs when she said that lively, diverse, intense cities contain the seeds for their own regeneration. I think that's a very nice quote, and I think it also sums up the paper very nicely. I have a few comments, or it's not really comments, some of them are ideas, some of them are questions that I would like to share with you now. So first of all, in your presentation, Janet elaborated a bit on you know, the pros and cons of diversity. I really like that that type of elaboration, and you said in the presentation that it's an empirical issue whether the net effect of diversity is positive or negative. And I think from reading the paper, I think that's a point that might be elaborated a bit more in the paper. The theoretical framework is rather short, but I think that's an extremely relevant point, that there are both pros and there are both pros and cons theoretically of diversity, and what you capture in these empirical papers is actually the net effect. So the coefficient for these indices of diversity will actually reflect the net effect of the positive and the negatives, right? And I also think that this is an issue that relates somehow to the scale of social interactions. So as Janet was saying, okay, there are some arguments saying that, well, entrepreneurs, they really rely on resources that they draw from their social networks, and their social networks in turn tend to be, related to, people of a particular culture or a particular age might prefer to interact with like-minded people, in a sense, right? So that means that there might be positive effect of homogeneity in that sense. So I think those kinds of elaborations might be worthwhile to elaborate a little bit more on, and I think it's very interesting. Okay. A second is more of a question. I think that, behind this is the idea, is somehow when I read the paper and also listened to the presentation, you get this, you start thinking about, well, whether entrepreneurship feeds itself. So for example, in the baseline model, you have firms per capita as, let's say, a control variable. And firms per capita is something that in a given year that will reflect, let's say, entrepreneurship in the past. So the more entrepreneurship you had in the past, the greater will be the density of firms per capita. So that's I'm wondering whether you could somehow expand analysis or try to somehow deal with the fact that entrepreneurship might feed itself. And it relates both to, let's say, diversity and, let's say, the idea of social interactions. Another thing that I really like with your paper, and this is just a, maybe a recommendation or an idea, is that when you look at the literature on new firm formation and diversity, the papers I read typically talk about industrial diversity, whereas Janet was saying, it's typically measured by a Herfindahl index or some typical measure like that. And the typical finding, the way I read the literature, is that, the influence of industrial diversity on new firm formation is sort of contingent on which type of industries we talk about, right? So I would say that the typical argument would be that, well, high-tech industries and more knowledge-intensive industries, entrepreneurship in those types of industries, they really benefit from diversity. Whereas, let's say, entrepreneurship in less knowledge-intensive industries, low-tech and more basic services, they might more be driven or less influenced by diversity. And I think here, you have potential to do a nice addition to this literature by see whether, the different dimensions of diversity also have this have different influence on the new firm formation rate in different industries, right? So you could test whether, for example, cultural diversity, is it the case that cultural diversity seems to matter more for startups in high-tech industries, or is it like industrial diversity does do, or is it different from that? And I think that's an interesting question to explore, actually.
Martin?
Yes?
I'm afraid we're at time. It's 10
Oh, sorry. Okay, I will just, I will go, I have a few things, just, I will start with the last comment then. I was very intrigued by Jane Jacobs' regeneration hypothesis. Maybe this is another paper, but I think, reading this paper really got me inspired. So I think behind the scene here, there is this question whether new firms expand the industrial base, right? So if you could add, let's say, the industry dimension, an interesting question to explore is whether new firms that sort of seem to thrive in diverse cities, do these new firms expand in industries that are strong in the city, or do these new firms tend to, let's say, expand the industrial base? Because if they do expand the industrial base so that, let's say, diversity actually influence entrepreneurship or startups in industries that are not so common in the city, is very close to, let's say, Jane Jacobs' ideas of regeneration. Okay, then I have a few remarks on demand and supply, but that's it. I really enjoyed the paper. I think we will very soon see this paper will be published in a good journal in the field. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Martin. Excellent comments. I'm going to turn this quickly over to Jaiwan because we're out of time.
And thank you, Martin.
All right, Martin, could you?
I will.
Be the host. Yep. First of all, I'd express my appreciation to Janet's beautiful presentation, also followed by the Martin's intensive discussion. This is the tradition of the WRSA, even though we meet virtually. All of us, I think, clearly demonstrated who we are and then how we are serious about discussions. And I think, this is a good example of WRSA. But I'm a strong believer for the interactive and person-to-person interaction. We can learn more out of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you where we can find. Do you see my screen, everyone?
Yes.
Okay, so on our website, the banner has changed from Hawaii to Palm Springs. Again, we had to cancel the meeting in Hawaii, but I want to show quickly, announce our meeting next year. And next year's meeting is has special meaning to us. It's the 60th annual meeting, and we're going back to Palm Springs, California. 40 years meeting, we had the Palm Springs. So 20 years after, we're going back to Palm Springs. And the meeting will be between February 21st and 24th of 2021. I know some of us are concerned about, do we really have the meeting because of the COVID-19? But I'm hopeful that we will have a vaccine available sometime by the end of this year or the next year. So we should all get reunited together in a healthy and beautiful Palm Springs, and then sharing the ideas and more interactions, and all the detailed information about how to submit paper is available. And also there's a meeting venue that's in the beautiful, let me just go back to, the meeting will be held in the beautiful Miramonte Resort in Palm Springs, and which is actually Indian Wells, suburb of Palm Springs. And hopefully we all get together. And until then, please stay healthy and strong, and we'll all get together to celebrate our 60th anniversary meeting in Palm Springs. So I don't think we have any questions posted on our chatting. So I want to wrap up here. And
Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
Thank you, Martin, for your great comments. If you wouldn't mind sending your slides to me, that'd be great.
I already sent them.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
And lastly, I want to thank everyone, the speaker, Janet, and the Martin, especially he joined us in the evening time from Sweden. And Jan, again, thank you for leading the discussion and the session. And of course, all those participants from around the world to join us today. And then we'll meet in person in Palm Springs next year. And again, you don't have to register until January 21st. The earlier the better, but you have time to think, and don't forget to submit your paper. So the paper submission due is October 30th, but we're gonna push it back a little bit to give you more flexibility toward the end of November. But I want to have many of us join the meeting and then have a face-to-face interaction there. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Bye.